time. We have the pleasure of having Rachel Goslins here, the director of the Smithsonian Arts and Industry, who will be presenting Reawakening, the National Mall's Sleeping Beauty, a look inside Smithsonian's Arts and Industries building. Prior to her appointment as director, Rachel served as executive director of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities and advisory committee to the White House on cultural policy. She founded a documentary production company, directing feature documentaries and working on productions for the Public Broadcasting Service, the Discovery Channel, the National Geographic Channel, and the History Channel. She also served as the director of Independent Digital Distribution Lab, of the Independent Digital Distribution Lab. And she began her career as an international copyright attorney, wide variety of experience. And she's also very active in the community and the arts. She serves on the board of trustees for the Greater Washington Community Foundation and the advisory boards for the Institute of Contemporary Art in Richmond, Virginia, and the Halcyon Social Impact Incubator in Washington, D.C. She is the 2012 Henry Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute. I want to welcome Rachel Goslins. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. I'm really excited to talk to you all today and talk about my favorite subject, which is the Arts and Industries building. Don't tell my kids. I am a little bit nervous talking to a whole bunch of architects and conservationists because you all are more expert than I am sure in many aspects of this amazing building. And so I'm going to attempt to share with you what I know and answer any questions, but in many ways, I think you all, if I walked you through this building, could tell me more about this building than I even know myself. So I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to take you through a little bit of a presentation, which is just pretty pictures, and then I'll do the talking around them. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the building, and then its kind of renovation history and current state. I'm going to spend a little time talking about the Futures, which is an exhibition we just opened last week in the building, its first major public exhibition in almost 20 years. And then happy to take any questions or talk about any follow-up you all might have. So let me try and share my screen at this point. And let's see if that works. All right, can you all see that? I assume that yes. Okay, great. So Arts and Industries building, one of my favorite buildings in Washington, D.C. As Joanna mentioned, I have a long and eclectic professional career, but one of the things that that is an apparent through line is that I only work in amazing buildings. When I came to DC, I was at the Library of Congress as an attorney, and I got to work in the Jefferson Building, which is just one of the most beautiful buildings in Washington, DC. I later went to work at the White House under President Obama and spent a lot of time at the White House, which is no slouch in terms of beautiful buildings, but my office was in the old post office building before it became a hotel, and I got to spend a lot of time in that building, which is so gorgeous. And now I get to have an office in a literal castle on the National Mall and be director of, just this gorgeous, gorgeous building. So the Arts and Industries building, oops, hold on. Let me just see if there we go. So the Arts and Industries building, let's just talk a second about this building. It is extraordinary in its architecture and design for a number of reasons. It is, Renaissance revival style, and it is considered one of the finest surviving buildings of late 19th century World's Fair architecture. It was built in part with the ticket proceeds from the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial, which is the World's Fair in America that kind of announced us to the world on our 100th birthday. It is the second Smithsonian building built on the National Mall. The first building was the Castle, and that was primarily our administrative center and also the residence of the first few secretaries. And at that time, the Smithsonian was an organization that had been founded for the increase in diffusion of knowledge, and it was kind of trying to figure out what that meant. But it was primarily a research and grant-making institution that also had explorers going out around the world and doing research and sending really interesting things back to headquarters, where they would be displayed in the lobby of the castle or our great hall. But it was the second secretary of the Smithsonian, with his head curator, James Brown Good, who decided to build a museum. And that was really the point at which the Smithsonian became the institution that we all know and love today. It was the moment at which the Smithsonian decided to turn outwards and start telling stories to the American public and really the entire world. So when Secretary Baird and Mr. Good decided to build a museum, they had to figure out what that is. What does the first US National Museum look like? And they did a tour of all the greatest European public museums. And they came back determined to build a distinctly American museum. They made a very conscious decision not to build a temple out of marble, but instead to build it out of brick, which was more of the sort of everyman's material. They decided not to build a building with a monumental staircase and a single entrance flanked by columns. Instead, they built the building on grade, and they put 4 entrances at the cardinal points of the compass. So there's an east and a south and a west and north entrance to signal that everybody was welcome wherever you came from. The building, if you'll see pictures of it in color a little bit later on, but it's got this wonderful mix of sort of monumentality and also whimsy. It has colored bricks and these gorgeous turrets and celestial windows. It was built at the time up to the highest level of environmental standards. If it was built today, it would be LEED Platinum certified. It had 984 windows, which make it challenging as a museum, but gorgeous as a building, most of which opened to catch the breeze coming off the Potomac and over the mall. This was built before HVAC or electricity, so it had to be, its galleries had to be 100% daylit, and it had to be able to maintain a certain level of environmental conditions just by taking advantage of natural light and natural breezes. It is just the most beautiful building, and I hope you all have been there or will come visit us sometime soon. It broke ground in 1879 and opened in early 1881. Its first event was the inaugural ball of President James A. Garfield, second shortest lived presidency, one of the longest lived buildings on the mall. And if you had gone to that inaugural ball, you would have seen this beautiful building decked out in a tremendous amount of bunting. They were very big on palms and bunting. And in the rotunda of that museum, or of that building, there was a lady in a toga holding up a torch. But instead of a torch made out of marble, which was, kind of practice at the time, she was holding up an electric light bulb. And this was the first time that electricity had been seen in Washington, D.C. It was 9 months after Thomas Edison patented the light bulb. And this really kicked off the Arts and Industries Building's history and mission of being the place that showed the marvels of the universe to the public. It was the place where the Smithsonian kept and displayed its biggest treasures and its biggest ideas and inventions that were going to change the world. In its early incarnation, it looked very much like the sort of curious cabinet of curiosities approach to museum storytelling. This was our Asian Hall. Part of this collection that you see here, or that we started with the building, was actually 22 railroads cars worth of artifacts and objects and inventions and new technologies that were taken from the Philadelphia Centennial and accessioned into the collection of the Smithsonian. These cases that you see here are interesting. They were on wheels. And this was the first ever, even back in those days, the curator, John Brown Good, who went on to become the first director of the Arts and Industries Building and my predecessor, wanted to design a system of exhibition that was flexible and mobile and dynamic and could be readjusted or reconfigured in many ways. And so he worked with the Smithsonian engineers to design these large cases that were on wheels and were mobile and could be moved around or changed as the collections changed. This is a photo I like to call Find the Octopus. This was our fisheries hall. And it's interesting looking at this, this was very much sort of the late 19th century version of the museum. Put every fishing lure known to man in a case, paper the walls with images and art. The version of storytelling in museums has evolved tremendously over the ensuing century and a half. But there is something just so glorious about this kind of profusion of objects and ideas, and this interdisciplinary approach. There's art here, there's installation, there's what we would consider sort of installations, there's artifacts, there's historical artifacts. It's kind of a great look at what museums used to look like. And so over the years, the building morphed and changes. Our central rotunda, which is a gorgeous monumental space, was at various times filled with a fountain. There's a fountain there for a long, long time. This was part of a installation about aerial photography that we did in the, I believe, early 60s, and we hung a hot air balloon in the rotunda. There were different time statues in there. The building is designed as a Greek cross, so it has 4 symmetrical halls, unified by a central rotunda, and then symmetrical galleries around the periphery of that. This is one of my favorite rotunda shots. So this is November 1969. This was 2 months after the first human walked on the moon. And we got a rock from the moon landing from NASA and put it in the rotunda of the Arts and Industries building. I mean, think of that, 2 months after we walked on the moon, we had a piece of the moon in the rotunda for everybody to see. I love the expression on the face of these, it's clearly a school field trip. You think about what it would take these days. I don't know how many of you work in the museum field, but to get an object like that, and then to accession it, and then to clean and preserve it, and then to plan an exhibition around it would have taken 5 to 8 years. But somehow within a couple months of us landing on the moon, we had a piece of that history to show to our visitors in the rotunda. Its very last iteration, well, let me go back. The building has 3 nicknames, I was told when I took on the job of being director about 5 years ago. One was the Palace of Invention, because it is the place where for now 140 years we've showcased the biggest ideas and the most interesting treasures of the Smithsonian and of this country. Another is the Mother of Museums, because this museum really incubated pretty much every other Smithsonian museum that followed it. So first it was just the US National Museum, and there was everything in there. We had the Star-Spangled Banner and the Wright Flyer and the Spirit of St. Louis and the Apollo 11 lunar capsule and inaugural ball gowns and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. But over time, our collections grew and grew. And so subsequent to the Arts and Industries building, we built the Museum of Natural History across the mall and moved our natural history collection in there. And then a little over a decade later, we started building the Museum of American History, which was then called the Museum of History and Technology, and moved that collection in there. And so in its last iteration, it was functionally the Air and Space Museum, because that was the big collection that we had left. And it served as the Air and Space Museum. This was called Rocket Row, until we built and opened the National Museum of Air and Space in 1976. Those of you who are paying attention will notice that I didn't tell you the 3rd nickname, which is actually my favorite, which is the Brick Tent. And I love that one because the building feels like a circus tent in brick, with all of its elevation and its monumental vertical spaces and its playfulness. It's as if you took a circus tent and froze it and built it in brick. So after we moved our Air and Space collection into the newly opened Museum of Air and Space, the last major public exhibition in the Arts and Industries building in a beautiful kind of coming full circle moment was a recreation of the 1876 Philadelphia World's Fair. And so in that building, we brought back the Jupiter steam locomotive, which was the first steam locomotive that was seen in the Arts and Industries building at the time, and a ship. Again, we brought back a lot of the bunting and the palms, not totally certain. And this was a wildly popular exhibition. We pulled out of our collections, so many of the artifacts from the 1876 World's Fair that we had taken into our collection and restaged kind of a snapshot of that World's Fair in the Arts and Industries building. And I believe that exhibition lasted about a year. And I still meet people who, when I tell them I'm the director of the Arts and Industries building, I remember going into, this is what they remember. They either remember Rocket Row from before this exhibition, or they remember this restaging of the Philadelphia Centennial and want to tell me stories about it. It's really fun to hear people's tales of remembering the Arts and Industries building. Lonnie Bunch, our secretary, has a great story of coming to the Arts and Industries building with his parents when he was a kid. So after this exhibition closed, the museum, which has always sort of lived its life in chapters, incubating different museums for a decade or so until they went on to become their own buildings, entered into a different phase where there was some small galleries that were preserved for public access and had kind of rotating temporary content. But it became primarily an administrative building. It housed a huge amount of our staffers. That's another thing people like to talk to me about. Is I had my office in the turret of the North Tower, and everybody has such strong memories of working in this building. They filled the second floor mezzanine level and many of the galleries with, frankly, the cubicles, and just put a lot of people in there. The Smithsonian preschool was in the building, Seek, where many of our current staff's children went. So they have really fond memories of that. And the building kind of limped along, quite frankly, in that way, because bear in mind now we're 110 years after it was built, and the building has never really been fully renovated. It's been jury rigged for whatever subsequent use was needed of it, but has never had the full kind of modernization and renovation that it needed. And so it was challenging, I think, working in the building during those days, but there was a lot of poetry and romance to it, and people loved working there. And by this point, there wasn't a director. I think I'm the first director in like 75 years, as far as we can tell, because as the last collection moved out of it, it became kind of a swing space, administrative space. And so then the building kind of moved along that way until about 2004, where, if some of you remember, there was a huge snowstorm, and another building designed by the same architect, Adolf Kloos, collapsed. The roof collapsed in Baltimore, and the Regents became very worried about the roof, the structure, the integrity of the roof, and made a pretty urgent decision to close the building. And they moved everybody out, and they closed the building without entirely a plan at that point about what they were going to do about reopening it, because at that point the building was in pretty bad nick and needed a tremendous amount of work, restoration. So then there was about 7 or 8 years while they worked with Congress to try and get the money for a renovation of the Arts and Industries building. And what they ended up succeeding at was getting about $54 million to do a structural renovation of the building. This mostly focused on the roof. We took off the entire historic roof and rebuilt it. You can see the pressed tin roof. It's a very industrial roof and a very artistic building. And so we replaced the entire roof, kept some of the original trusses from 1876, 1879. If any of you want to come visit, I can point those out to you. But mostly put a modern version of the historic roof back on it. We replaced almost all the windows in the building. We repointed the brick. We did some work on the foundation. So we basically did a really substantial renovation of the envelope of the building. So the building is now safe and sound and can stand for another 500 years. They didn't have money or really a vision for what they wanted the inside of the building to do. So they really kind of put it into caretaker status, what they called caretaker status. They cleaned out a lot of the detritus, a lot of the temporary walls and infills that had been put into the building over 140 years. They returned it to its period of historical significance, which is about 1904 to 1910, 1912, and left it in what looks like a beautiful condition. Like this, you look at this and it looks gorgeous, but you scratch this little bit of a Potemkin village. If you went through any of those doors or doorways, you would see a tremendous amount of temporary machinery, peeling walls, rooms we're not allowed to go into because they still have too much asbestos or lead paint in them. We like to call it industrial chic. That's what we call the building, but it's still waiting for a major renovation and revitalization effort to become a modern museum or exhibition space, as the Smithsonian moves ahead and thinking about what it wants to do with this incredible building. That was the point that I was brought on in 2016, summer of 2016, I came on, and originally my brief was to help the Smithsonian start to think about the future of this building and what that would mean, both in terms of design and engineering, what that means in terms of content and vision, what kinds of purposes this could serve the institution. It's sort of the first time in the institution's 175-year history that we have an empty building without a collection that is assigned to that building. And that is a tremendous once in an institutional lifetime opportunity to take a historic building like this and be allowed to sort of decide what to do with it, as opposed to what normally happens at the Smithsonian, which is we are given a mission to build a particular museum, and then we build the building to fit that mission. But here we have this gorgeous, eclectic, eccentric space and the opportunity to think creatively about what purpose that might serve for both the institution and the American public. So I was brought in to lead that effort in the middle of 2016, started down that path, no small feat. Depending on how you calculate it, I was either the 7th or 8th person or group of people brought in to try and figure out what to do with this building. I was the first director in a long time, so that was really helpful. I had more authority and agency than the folks who went behind me, but there were various committees and consultants and special projects people who are all, for the last 10 years, have been trying to figure out what to do with this building. So if it was an easy answer, somebody would have done it before me. So I started that work of assessing the condition of the building, bringing in an architectural design firm to help me understand what the building was capable of, working with our historic folks who about what was possible with the building. It's a historic landmark. It's an endangered building, and obviously there's a lot, it is very important to keep its historic fabric and personality, which is somewhat limiting when you're thinking about the needs of modern museums these days. Again, 984 windows makes it very hard to control light, and the brick porosity makes it very hard to control temperature and pH balance and all the other things we have to think about when we're thinking about whether a space is capable of sustaining collections in the way that we generally do at the Smithsonian. So I was happily tootling along in that job and working with Smithsonian leadership, the Board of Regents, working with my fellow directors in museums across across the mall and in our other cities to get their thoughts on how this building might best serve the institution. And then for one fateful day, I was in the then Secretary Scorton, the secretary previous to our current secretary. I was in Secretary Scorton's office with our then chairman of the Board of Regents, David Rubenstein. And we were all talking about what we might do to sort of start to build momentum around the Arts and Industries building, now that we had a building that was safe to be in, even though challenging inside to work within because of its unrenovated condition. And also a couple of years from then, it was going to be the 175th anniversary. And so somebody, it wasn't me, had the brilliant idea of like, hey, Rachel, how about you do like a pop-up exhibition in the building before we close it and move forward with a major renovation? And that could be the centerpiece of our 175th anniversary. And me being the wide-eyed, somewhat naive person new to the world of the Smithsonian, and I said, what a great idea, absolutely. And so then the idea for Futures was born. And Futures is the exhibition I was talking about that we just opened last week. Oh, sorry, one more pretty picture of our rotunda. And so Futures is the first ever Smithsonian exhibition about the future on the National Mall. We do a lot of amazing work helping people understand the past and to some extent the present, but there's more that we could do in helping people think about the future. We are in a world where people don't trust the media, they don't trust government, they don't trust science or research. People still trust museums. And that's that civic trust is an incredibly valuable resource. And what we wanted to do with Futures as an institution is use some of that trust to try and help people think about the future in a moment that can feel really challenging, to help them think about the future in a way that allows them to feel more empowered, more inspired, and frankly, more hopeful. We have so much help these days in the world around us, imagining what could go wrong in the future. And that's an important conversation. But if you look at science fiction, if you turn on the news, if you listen to public intellectuals, dystopia sells. So we have so much help imagining what could go wrong, but we don't have nearly as much help imagining what could go right. And that is equally important, because if we can't imagine the future we want to live in, then we are unlikely to feel empowered or hopeful about getting there. And indeed, global surveys show that there is more anger and anxiety and feelings of powerlessness about the future than any time since they've started doing these global and national polls. So it's a challenge to do. Well, we started this 3 years ago. So even before the pandemic and 2020, with all of its upheaval, it was a challenge to figure out how to do an exhibition that was hopeful about the future, that asked people to imagine the future they want and not the future they fear. But it also felt really important, and it felt like a great way to pull in all of the incredible resources of the Smithsonian from the collections of our 12 different museums and our 8 different research units to talk to people about the history of the future and then the future of the future. So Futures as the first major public exhibition in the space in like the last 20 years. And opened last weekend to, I don't know, toot our own horn, but my team is amazing, like to incredible, I mean, it went off better than we could have possibly hoped. It got a huge amount of attention. I think there is a huge hunger for messages about a future that is more hopeful, or a future that has solutions in it as well as just problems. We got a huge amount of press for BBC and Washington Post and New York Times and CBS Sunday Morning and all over. That was sort of fantastic, and had a great public opening. But it was sort of the most gratifying thing was the reactions of the visitors. People just loved it. And we had our second day of opening. We had 40,000 people come through the building in the first 4 days we were open. Our first day was Saturday, November 20th, and that was our public opening. And then our second day, November 21st, was Family Day. Now, we did this exhibition on a pretty short budget, so normally you wouldn't test everything in the exhibition, all your visitor services, all of your technology, everything, by releasing a herd of toddlers on it. But that was how we means tested our exhibition. Was like the second day we opened, we had family days, and the exhibition really performed really well. It is an interdisciplinary exhibition that looks at the future through the lens of different values that we might want in the future. It is not topic-based. Traditionally, the traditional way to do an exhibition about the future is to organize it by topic: future of food, future of work, future of transportation. And we, after doing a lot of audience research as we started our curation, decided to organize it around values instead. So the first hall is that you saw back here is past futures, and it has many of our artifacts from the past, everything from the first telephone to the machine that first produced commercial plastic, to a divining rod from the Yoruba tribe in West Africa that they used to try and tell the future, and helps people understand about how we have always been trying to predict and shape the future since pretty much we discovered fire. And then it goes, after you go into our rotunda, then you can choose 3 different futures to explore. You can explore all of them. It's kind of a choose your own adventure. And there are futures that unite, futures that inspire, and futures that work. And in each of those, we have a mixture of science and technology and art and speculative design that looks at how just possible ideas that might bring us closer to the kind of future we want to live in. It's just been really gratifying to see folks go through the building. Every day we've been open, I've gone and stood outside and just grabbed people as they came out and said, what did you like? What did you think? And what we've heard, which is so affirming. Well, I think my favorite comment, somebody said, I came expecting this to be an exhibition about technology, but actually it's an exhibition about people. And that is something that we really strive to do. We didn't want you to walk in and have it look like Best Buy with all these screens blaring at you, and to give the message that somehow technology was the answer to the future, because it really isn't. It's really people. And that's why we called the exhibition The Futures as opposed to the future. This to reinforce this idea that there is no one future. There are many possible futures, and which one we live in or end up in, or our children and grandchildren end up in, is going to be determined by our individual and collective choices. We have quotes on all of our walls. We did a great crowdsourcing campaign. I think you can see some of them here. Hold on. Yeah, you can see some of them along here. So we put out on social media and amongst the Smithsonian staff, called to send us your favorite quotes about the future. We have everything from Toni Morrison to Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, to William Shakespeare, to Anne Frank on the walls. But the quote that you see when you come into the building is from Carl Sagan. And it's really the organizing principle of our exhibition, and why we decided to go with this kind of focus on what is possible. And he said, the visions we tell our children about the future matter. Often they become self-fulfilling prophecies. Dreams are maps. So dreams are maps is what we kept telling ourselves as we put this exhibition together. And if we can't dream something, we can't achieve it, at the risk of sounding overly naive about all the challenges that we will face in the future. But that is our exhibition and our incredible building. And I encourage you all to come down and visit. I would love to hear what you think. And you'll also get to see a lot of the incredible architecture of the building. You can get more information about us and what we're doing. We have a robust slate of programming planned for the run of the exhibition, which runs through 4th of July weekend next summer. And so pretty much every week we have panels or discussions or virtual events exploring different aspects of the future. And we have a great social media. I have, super fun, interesting social media presence, talking about some of the content in our exhibition and some of the interesting news and developments that are out there in the world. So anyway, come on down, come visit, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I see something in the chat. Are we planning other exhibitions around large themes like this? What a great question. Hi, Jane. So the question is, are we planning other exhibits around large themes like this? And the short answer is we hope so. This is a great use of the building. Like this, one of the reasons we did this exhibition was to sort of pilot how we might use the building in the future. No pun intended, after having it closed for so long. And also to pilot new ways of storytelling at the Smithsonian writ large. So these kind of interdisciplinary, it's not based in one particular collection. Much of our content is pulled from outside partnerships. This is all kind of new ground for the Smithsonian. And so one of the reasons that we wanted to do this and we're supported so strongly in doing this exhibition is to kind of experiment with new ways of storytelling that either we'll keep doing at AIB or some of our other sister museums around the mall are also increasingly interested in experimenting with. Are there other questions? People can raise their hand. They can just chime in. Do you want me to talk more about architecture? You want me to pretend that I know more about architecture? I was very impressed with my reference to Renaissance revival architecture.
I'll chime in with a question. I just am thinking about, you probably have so many different new objects and sort of prototypes designed for this exhibition. And is there a plan to collect any of those and start building a collection, or will they all be returned at the end? Just curious about that.
No, it's a great question. They will all, well, probably 30% of our exhibition are Smithsonian objects and research materials that will go back to that were on loan to us from other Smithsonian museums. So they'll go back to, we have stuff from the Air and Space Museum and the American History Museum and the Cooper Hewitt and African art. So those will go back to their homes. And then all the other content was loaned to us by technology companies or scientists or design firms. We have 6 original art commissions in the show that are spectacular. But all of those will go back. This is an experiment in asset light exhibition. There's a few things that may end up in a collection that I know the folks at NASM have their eyes on, or the folks at American History have their eyes on. But mostly the idea for this was to experiment with a way of pulling together an exhibition that married the resources and the existing collections of the Smithsonian with the kinds of things, it turns out if you're doing an exhibition at the Smithsonian and you ask somebody to lend you something, they're super excited to have it included in an exhibition, especially if it's about the future and especially if it's about a hopeful future. So we got all kinds of crazy. We have the Pegasus Hyperloop pod, which is is huge. It's like a predecessor, not a predecessor, the Jupiter locomotive that we displayed in 1881 is its predecessor, but it's the pod that was used to first test human passengers in testing the Hyperloop technology, and that was tested less than a year ago. So less than a year from that, we have it on display in our exhibition for the first time. The public is seeing it, but then they'll take it back and do more testing with it, things like that.
I have a question. Can you give us a kind of a sneak peek into what some of the renovation plans are for the building?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that many people, including myself, are curious about. There's nothing like an empty building on the National Mall to invite many opinions on what you should do with it, and all are interesting and good. We're currently working with an engineering design with an architectural design and engineering firm to really assess the building at a deeper level than I was able to do in my first couple of years, to look at what it's capable of and how it might be, how its spaces might be used to support more traditional museum practice. The ultimate content of the building, what it sort of becomes, is very much an open question. There are a lot of great ideas and a lot of great uses for this building. The conversation was made more interesting by the legislation that passed last Christmas during the pandemic over the last holiday season, so I guess about a year ago, that mandated that the Smithsonian start two new museums, the Museum of the American Latino and the Museum of Women's History. And the Arts and Industries building was named as a possible site in both of those legislations, in both of those bills. So we're currently going through a site selection process to look at where those two new museums will be situated, whether on the mall or off the mall, whether existing buildings or new construction. And so the Arts and Industries building is part of that conversation. And then after that conversation concludes, and if the Arts and Industries building does not end up being one of those two new specifically focused museums, then there'll be a really interesting conversation about what else we might do with it. But in the meantime, we're doing the kind of unglamorous nuts and bolt work of figuring out how deep we could dig down, what kinds of it doesn't have a mechanical room because it was designed before electricity. So how do you update it in that way? What kinds of things might you do to make the environmental conditions more conducive to collections? So we're in a pretty exhaustive process with the firm EYP to do all that assessment right now.
We have another question. With National Registered buildings, the exterior is usually what is the most protected portion. With the future uses of this building, is there going to be a focus on preserving the interior character?
Yes, we have a very muscular and very strong historic preservation department at the Smithsonian, which is its whole mission is to preserve the historic fabric and characteristics of our building. So in addition to whatever is mandated by the National Historic Guidelines and Regulations, there's any decisions about what to do with the interior of the building have to go through our historic preservation folks. And they're both incredibly creative and supportive, and they want to see the building be used again, but they're also very focused on making sure that it retains its architectural character. It is, as I said, like really one of the best and last surviving examples of this kind of architecture in the country. And so their mission is, is to make sure that it remains historically intact and as much as possible adheres to its layout and use at its period of historic significance.
So I was noticing that with such high ceilings in the exhibition, the lighting looked very difficult to plan.
So
talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we had fantastic exhibition designers. When we went out to design this exhibition, we had RFPs, we put out an RFP and we got a lot of great responses from a lot of great exhibition designers, sort of more traditional exhibition designers, but who I ended up going with was Rockwell Group in New York. And what they're primarily known for is theatrical design. They have like a bazillion Tonys. They've also done work in the cultural sector and done some museum work. They do also a lot of commercial work, but I really picked them because I wanted them to think of the building as a set and to design, a set within the building that could work within the building's constraints, which are significant, both in terms of being unrenovated and in terms of being historic. So we can't attach anything to the walls and we can't, hang anything from the trusses. So they worked very hard on lighting, and I'm sure we didn't do it, they would have had to spend double our budget just on lighting. But we managed to find a lot of workarounds and I think the exhibition looks strong both in daytime and in the dark, and in nighttime, which was a challenge.
I think from the pictures, I agree. Says, we've got another comment. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. You had mentioned a social media campaign to gather quotes about the future before the exhibition. Is there an ongoing effort to collaborate with visitors online now that the exhibition is open?
Yes, both through social media and through something we haven't launched yet, but we'll be launching in the next couple of months. So we have a super active social media following, and we are, pretty playful about it. And we look for ways to interact with our with people who are interested in what we're doing in lots of different ways. One way of my favorite as you go out of the exhibition, we have cards you can fill out that that are your intentions for the future. And so they're different cards. There's 3 different time scales, and it says, in the next day, I will blank to make a future that is blank. And then another one says, in the next week, I will blank to make a future that is blank. And then in the next year, we can blank to make a future that is blank. And so folks have been just filling these out by the hundreds, like, and they're so good. You have little ones from little kids with the R, backward R, saying what they're going to do to build a future they want to live in. And also people, 92-year-olds. And so we've been taking a certain number of those every week and putting them out on social media. Here's what our visitors are saying, here's what they're committing to do in the future, and asking our social media community to contribute their own to that. So that's just one example, but we look for different ways to engage our community that way. And then we'll be releasing kind of a new kind of museum app called Your Futures Guide, which we're in the process of developing with a media firm out in Northern California, that I think will be a super cool, interesting way to talk about exhibitions, where you'll answer some questions about the future, and then you'll get a call back from your future self who talks to you about the future that he or she is living in. Anyway, it sounds super cool. People much more intelligent and sophisticated about these kinds of things are working on it, and I'm really excited to launch that. That should launch in late February or early March.
Oh, something to look forward to. Thank you. You mentioned difficulties in regulating temperature and humidity. Was this an issue for the artifacts in the future exhibit?
Oh, Rachel, you're going to break my heart. So there were so many things I wanted to put in this exhibition that I couldn't, because we just didn't have the environmental controls. We have in our collection at the Smithsonian a Chrysler turbine car. It looks a little bit like that old Batmobile, the really long one. But it's a Chrysler turbine. It was exhibited at the 1964 New York World's Fair, and it has a jet engine that runs on any kind of alcohol. So you can run it on tequila, you can run it on, it went to Paris and was run on Chanel No. 5, and it's gold, and it's just so gorgeous. It's like a, 1960s jet engine gold car that you can run on tequila. And I so desperately wanted that in my exhibition, and I couldn't get it because apparently cars, I don't know, you'd think a car was kind of hardy, but there's only 2 of them in existence. And unless we could put it in a case that had its own temperature and humidity controls, they wouldn't let us display it. Understandably, their job is to protect these objects. And to build a case for that car would have been half of my exhibition budget. So there's 5 or 6 things that I really, really wanted. Mostly historical artifacts that we didn't have the environmental conditions to exhibit. Most of the future focusing stuff, the art and the speculative designs and the prototypes and the scientific stuff, people didn't have any problems lending that to us. But there are a few historic things that I still mourn.
And now I want to see this car.
Oh my God, so cool. Just Google Chrysler turbine World's Fair.
Does anyone else have any questions? Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for your presentation. It's wonderful. I think you got us excited about future of not only the Arts and Industry Building, but also the future as well. We really appreciate your time.
Well, please do come visit, you guys. I would love to, and if I'm there, come up and introduce yourselves, and I'll give you a little architectural tour. But really, would love to hear what you all think.
We might all hold you to that. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.